The midday sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Brookfield, Ohio. Sergeant Brian Calloway, his hand resting on the steering wheel of his patrol car, surveyed his familiar beat. A quiet street, lined with imposing houses, the kind that whispered of old money and carefully curated lives. He'd spent years patrolling these streets, knew the rhythm of the place, the ebb and flow of life behind those closed doors. He liked the predictability, the sense of order. It affirmed his belief in his own ability to maintain it. A figure jogging up ahead caught his eye. A black woman, athletic build, dressed in running gear. Nothing inherently unusual, yet a prickle of unease tightened his chest. He couldn't articulate it. Not yet. Just a feeling. She didn't acknowledge his presence. Her gaze fixed ahead, a flicker of defiance, maybe, in her unwavering stride. Calloway slowed the cruiser, his eyes tracking her. She's too focused, he thought, almost as if she's trying not to be noticed. The thought, once formed, solidified into suspicion. He watched her approach a parked car, a sleek, silver Mercedes, gleaming under the Ohio sun. The kind of car that didn't quite belong in Brookfield. Not usually, anyway. Expensive. Too expensive for a jogger. His mind conjured images of break-ins, of stolen goods. The unease blossomed into a certainty that something wasn't right. He pulled the patrol car up beside her, the engine's low hum cutting through the afternoon quiet. She stopped, her breath catching in her chest, the sheen of sweat on her forehead. Her dark eyes, sharp and intelligent, met his. There was a flicker of annoyance, a flash of something he interpreted as guilt. He stepped out of the car, his hand instinctively resting on his holster, the weight of authority settling upon him. The air thickened, the quiet amplified by the unspoken tension. He could feel his pulse quickening, the familiar adrenaline surge of a potential confrontation. He liked this feeling, the power, the control. "Where you coming from?" he asked, his voice clipped, official. His mind was already racing, constructing a narrative, piecing together the fragments of his suspicion. Sweaty, expensive car, avoiding eye contact. "She's hiding something." "Home," she replied, her voice even controlled. "Just getting in my run." She gestured vaguely towards one of the larger houses further down the street. A dismissive flick of her wrist. Calloway noted the gesture, the subtle defiance in it. "She's lying," he thought, trying to play it cool. "Mind if I see some ID?" he asked, his tone hardening. He could see the flicker of surprise in her eyes, a brief widening before her expression schooled into something colder, harder. "Excuse me," she said, her voice laced with disbelief. She's playing the innocent card, he thought, classic tactic. Calloway's suspicion morphed into certainty. He knew the type. He felt a surge of righteousness, a conviction that he was upholding the law, protecting his community. He repeated his request, his voice sharper this time, his hand still hovering near his holster. He watched her carefully, looking for any sign of weakness, any crack in her composure. Her jaw tightened. "I haven't done anything wrong," she said, her voice low, controlled. "I'm simply jogging in my neighborhood." He could see the anger simmering beneath the surface, the restrained fury in her eyes. He mistook it for fear, for the desperation of a cornered criminal. He felt a thrill course through him, the satisfaction of having her on the ropes. "Look, ma'am, I'm just doing my job," he said, his voice laced with a false sincerity. "Just show me your ID, and we can clear this up." His internal monologue ran rampant. She's playing games. She thinks she's above the law. Daniels stood her ground, her chest rising and falling with her controlled breaths. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the distant hum of traffic. A man in a business suit, briefcase in hand, paused on the sidewalk, observing the scene with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Other bystanders began to gather, their whispers adding to the growing tension. Calloway felt their eyes on him, not judging, but expectant. It fueled his resolve. "I'm Chief Simone Daniels," she finally said, her voice low but firm, each word measured, precise. She reached into her pocket, her movements deliberate, slow, and pulled out her badge. The afternoon sun glinted off the metal, reflecting the light into Calloway's eyes. He blinked, momentarily blinded, both physically and metaphorically. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Chief Daniels? The name resonated, echoing in the hollow space of his mind. His carefully constructed narrative crumbled, the pieces scattering like dust in the wind. He stared at the badge, at the woman before him, his mind struggling to reconcile the image he'd created with the reality that stood before him. A knot of dread tightened in his stomach, cold and heavy. He could feel the blood draining from his face, the sweat on his palms turning icy. The whispers of the onlookers intensified, morphing into murmurs of disbelief. The man in the suit stepped forward, his expression a mix of shock and disgust. "Officer, I saw everything," he said, his voice clear and steady. "She did absolutely nothing wrong." The words hung in the air, heavy with condemnation. Calloway felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He could see the headlines now, the scandal, the disgrace. He could feel his career slipping away, his reputation tarnished, his life irrevocably altered. Captain Ronald Briggs arrived on the scene, his face a mask of thunder. He listened to Daniel's account, his gaze fixed on Calloway, the unspoken questions hanging heavy in the air. The shame burned through Calloway, a searing brand on his soul. The following days were a blur of interrogations, disciplinary hearings, and sleepless nights. Calloway's actions, driven by his ingrained biases and flawed assumptions, had cost him everything. He lost his job, his standing in the community, and, most importantly, his own sense of self. He was left with the crushing weight of his mistake, forced to confront the ugly truth of his prejudice. The quiet streets of Brookfield, once a symbol of order and predictability, now echoed with the whispers of his failure. He was left to wander those streets, a ghost of his former self, haunted by the specter of what he had done. He replayed the scene over and over in his mind, each repetition a fresh wound, a constant reminder of the injustice he had perpetrated. The shame, once a burning fire, now settled into a dull ache, a constant companion in the wreckage of his life. The crisp morning air bit at Simone's cheeks, a stark contrast to the burning indignation rising in her chest. The patrol car, a hulking metal beast, still idled by the curb, its presence a physical manifestation of the invisible wall that had just been erected between her and her morning run. Calloway, the officer, stood before her, a rigid silhouette against the backdrop of the rising sun. He'd asked for identification, a simple request, yet it echoed with the weight of 1,000 unspoken accusations. Simone's breath hitched, not from exertion, but from the sheer audacity of it all. Identification? She ran this city's police force. She was the law, embodied. "You pulled me over," she began, each word clipped and precise, "to stop a woman jogging in broad daylight because you think I'm a threat?" The question hung in the air, thick and heavy like the exhaust fumes from the idling car. A muscle twitched in Calloway's jaw. He shifted his weight, the movement betraying a flicker of something Simone couldn't quite place on ease, perhaps? Or was it just annoyance? He held out his hand, palm up, a gesture that grated on Simone's nerves. "Show me some identification." His voice was flat, devoid of inflection, as if reciting a well-rehearsed line. The banality of the request in the face of such a blatant act of profiling felt almost surreal. A wave of dizziness washed over Simone. Was this really happening? Was this the reality of her life? Even at the top of the food chain? Her internal monologue raged. Comply? Refuse? What would make the least damage, not just for her, but for every other black woman who'd ever been unfairly targeted? The weight of the moment pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating. The eyes of the few passers-by now lingered on the scene, curious, apprehensive. Their gazes felt like tiny pinpricks, each one a reminder of the public spectacle her life had become. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the message it sent. A man in a crisp suit paused on the sidewalk, phone held loosely in his hand. His eyes flickered between Simone and Calloway, a silent observer to the unfolding drama. Simone registered his presence peripherally, aware that this interaction was no longer private, but a performance played out on the public stage. The thought sent a chill down her spine. "Officer," she said, her voice now laced with a dangerous calm that belied the tempest raging within. "I am asking you, what is the legal basis for this stop?" Each word was a carefully placed stone, building a wall of resistance against the tide of his presumed authority. Calloway's jaw tightened further. The flicker of unease she had glimpsed earlier was gone, replaced by a steely resolve. "Ma'am," he said, the word dripping with condescension, "I need to see your identification. Are you refusing to comply with a lawful order?" Simone's mind raced. Lawful? Was anything about this lawful? The absurdity of the situation threatened to overwhelm her. Here she was, the chief of police, being questioned by a subordinate who clearly didn't recognize her, being treated like a common criminal. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to maintain a semblance of composure. The crisp morning air filled her lungs, momentarily clearing the fog of disbelief. "I am not refusing," she stated, her voice unwavering. "I am questioning the legitimacy of your request. You have no probable cause to detain me." Calloway's eyes narrowed. The subtle shift in his posture, the tightening of his grip on his belt, spoke volumes. He was losing patience. The small crowd of onlookers had grown, their murmurs adding to the growing tension in the air. Simone could feel their collective gaze, the weight of their expectations pressing down on her. Inside, a war raged. One part of her, the pragmatic, strategic part, screamed at her to defuse the situation, to simply show her ID and be on her way. But another part, a deeper, more visceral part, refused to yield. This wasn't just about her morning run. It was about principle. It was about justice. It was about the countless others who didn't have her position, her voice, her platform. "I'm giving you one last chance," Calloway said, his voice now taking on a harder edge. "Show me your ID, or I'll be forced to place you under arrest for obstruction." The words hung in the air, sharp and menacing. A knot tightened in Simone's stomach. Arrest? The thought was ludicrous, yet the unwavering glint in Calloway's eyes told her he was deadly serious. He was actually going to arrest her. His chief of police. A wave of exhaustion washed over her, a deep, bone-weary fatigue that had nothing to do with her morning run. This was the reality of her existence, the constant battle against prejudice, the unending struggle to be seen, to be heard, to be respected. "You're arresting me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, the question laced with a mixture of disbelief and resignation. Calloway's expression remained impassive. He reached for his handcuffs, the metallic click echoing in the sudden stillness of the morning. "You're obstructing justice," he said, his voice cold and impersonal, as if reciting a legal statute. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The click of the handcuffs, the cold steel against her wrists, the murmurs of the crowd, it all blended into a surreal cacophony. Simone closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, bracing herself for the storm she knew was coming. The metallic click of the handcuffs echoed in the crisp morning air, a sound that reverberated not just through Simone's ears, but through the very core of her being. A cold, hard band of steel encircled her wrist, digging into her skin like an accusation. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, a molten lava of indignation bubbling dangerously close to eruption. Obstruction? The word, flung at her like a stone, ricocheted in her mind. This wasn't obstruction. This was a blatant abuse of power, a public display of prejudice thinly veiled under the guise of law enforcement. Calloway's face, a mask of self-righteous authority just moments ago, now held a flicker of something else. Uncertainty? Perhaps even a sliver of doubt, as if the weight of his actions was finally beginning to settle upon him. He avoided her gaze, his eyes darting nervously towards the growing crowd of onlookers. Simone's heart pounded against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the cage of her constrained arms. Her breath hitched, a strangled gasp caught in the tightness of her throat. Years of training, Years of maintaining composure under pressure threatened to crumble under the sheer absurdity of the situation. She focused on the sensation of the cool morning breeze against her skin, a stark contrast to the burning anger that coursed through her veins. "Control, Simone. Control." She repeated the mantra silently, willing her body to obey. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been unjustly targeted, every individual who had been judged based on the color of their skin rather than the content of their character. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. "You really think this is going to go your way?" The words slipped out, low and steady, laced with a quiet power that belied the turmoil raging within her. Calloway's eyes finally met hers, his gaze flickering like a dying flame. He swallowed hard, the prominent Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. The uncertainty she had glimpsed earlier was now a full-blown storm raging behind his eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words seemed to catch in his throat, a strangled sound escaping instead. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken tension. The air crackled with the collective breath of the onlookers, a silent chorus of disbelief and simmering anger. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a low hum of indignation. A man in a sharp business suit stepped forward, his face a mixture of concern and outrage. "Officer," he began, his voice firm and measured, "I witnessed the entire incident. This woman did nothing wrong. You need to let her go." Calloway's gaze darted towards the man, then back to Simone, his eyes wide with a dawning comprehension that he had drastically miscalculated. The confident facade he had so carefully constructed began to crumble, revealing the cracks of insecurity beneath. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for his radio. "Dispatch, I need a unit for Transport Code 3. His voice, usually so authoritative, now wavered, a thin thread of panic weaving through his words. Each click and whir of the radio seemed to amplify the tension, the static filling the void of unspoken words. The weight of the situation pressed down on Calloway, suffocating him with the realization of his colossal blunder. The faces in the crowd blurred into a sea of judgment, each stare a burning indictment. He could feel the sweat trickling down his back, a cold, clammy reminder of the precarious position he had placed himself in. He tried to swallow, but his throat was dry, his mouth suddenly filled with the bitter taste of regret. The distinctive wail of approaching sirens sliced through the air, a harbinger of impending judgment. Calloway flinched, his body tensing in anticipation. The cruiser pulled up to the curb, its flashing lights painting the scene in alternating hues of red and blue. Two officers emerged, their expressions shifting from professional detachment to open surprise as they took in the scene before them their sergeant, handcuffing the chief of police. A heavy silence descended, broken only by the rhythmic thump of Simone's heart against her ribs. From the corner of her eye, she saw a familiar figure emerge from the cruiser. Captain Briggs. His face was a thundercloud, his eyes narrowed into slits of fury. He strode towards Calloway, his steps measured and deliberate, each footfall echoing like a death knell. Calloway's breath caught in his throat. He knew, with a sickening certainty, that his career was hanging by a thread. The look on Briggs' face was not merely anger. It was disappointment, a deep and profound disillusionment that cut deeper than any reprimand. "Calloway." Briggs' voice was low and dangerous, barely above a growl. "What in the hell is the meaning of this?" Calloway opened his mouth to explain, to justify, to somehow salvage the remnants of his dignity, but the words wouldn't come. His carefully constructed world of order and control had shattered, leaving him standing amidst the ruins of his own making. He fumbled with the handcuffs, his fingers clumsy and unresponsive. The metallic click as he released Simone's wrist was the sound of his own undoing. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant murmur of the crowd. Simone rubbed her wrists, the imprint of the handcuffs a burning reminder of the injustice she had endured. She met Briggs' gaze, her own eyes reflecting a mixture of anger, frustration, and a steely resolve. This wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The weight of the cuffs bit into Simone's wrists, a cold, metallic sting against the heat generated by her run. Each breath, still ragged from exertion, fanned the embers of a slow-burning fury. Calloway remained impassive, a granite statue carved from self-righteousness. She could practically see the gears turning behind his eyes, churning through justifications for this blatant act of racial profiling. He thinks he caught a big fish, she thought, the irony thick and bitter in her throat. He has no idea. The murmuring crowd pressed closer, their phones held aloft like flickering candles in a silent vigil. She saw a flash of recognition in the eyes of a man in a dark suit, a flicker of understanding that mirrored her own simmering rage. Good, she thought, a witness. Calloway shifted his weight, the subtle movement betraying a crack in his composed facade. He ran a hand through his short, bristly hair, the gesture almost unconsciously revealing a thread of unease. He likely hadn't anticipated such a large audience. His internal monologue, Simone imagined, was a chaotic scramble of self-doubt and dogged justification, the clash echoing in the tremor of his hand. He cleared his throat, a dry, rasping sound that cut through the low hum of the crowd. "Just stay put," he directed at Simone, the words tight, strained. "Control," Simone recognized. He needs to maintain control. The thought was almost amusing if it weren't so infuriating. A siren wailed in the distance, cutting through the thick air like a knife. The sound grew louder, closer, until a police cruiser screeched to a halt just feet away. The crowd parted like water, a ripple of anticipation spreading through them. Calloway stiffened, his eyes darting to the approaching figure. Simone felt a flicker of grim satisfaction. Showtime, she thought. Captain Briggs emerged from the car, his face a thundercloud of displeasure. He strode towards them, his gait sharp and purposeful, his eyes fixed on Calloway. Simone could practically feel the waves of disapproval radiating from him, a palpable force that pushed against the tension in the air. Calloway's posture shifted again, this time a subtle shrinking, a pulling inward. He was starting to realize he'd made a mistake, a monumental, career-ending mistake. But the realization was too late. The damage was done. Briggs stopped in front of them, his gaze sweeping over the scene, taking in the handcuffs, the crowd, the simmering resentment etched on Simone's face. His jaw tightened. "Calloway," he barked, his voice laced with steel. "What in the hell is going on here?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations. Calloway swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. His eyes darted between Briggs and Simone, a flicker of panic igniting in their depths. He opened his mouth to speak, then hesitated, the words catching in his throat. He knew whatever explanation he offered would sound hollow, pathetic. His internal monologue, Simone imagined, was a frantic scramble for justification, a desperate attempt to salvage a situation that was already beyond repair. Briggs didn't wait for an answer. His eyes, sharp and assessing, narrowed. "Uncuff her," he commanded, his voice clipped and cold. The words were simple, direct, and carried the weight of absolute authority. The command reverberated through the silent crowd, a ripple of shock and anticipation spreading through them. Calloway's hand trembled as he reached for the key, the metal cold against his clammy skin. He fumbled with the lock, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. Simone felt the cuffs release, the sudden absence of pressure a stark contrast to the lingering ache in her wrists. She rubbed her skin, the friction a small comfort against the deep-seated humiliation. She met Briggs' gaze, her own eyes holding a flicker of something he couldn't quite decipher. It was a mixture of anger, disappointment, and a profound weariness. She straightened, her posture regaining its usual confident stance. The crowd held its breath, sensing the shift in the air, the subtle change in power dynamics. Calloway finally managed to unlock the cuffs, his face pale and drawn. He stepped back, creating a small space between himself and Simone, as if distancing himself from the unfolding disaster. His internal monologue, Simone imagined, was a cacophony of regret, a desperate plea for forgiveness that he knew wouldn't come. Simone took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the air fill her lungs, steadying her nerves. She turned to Calloway, her gaze piercing, unflinching. "My name," she said, her voice calm, steady, "is Chief Simone Daniels." She paused, letting the words sink in, letting them hang in the air like a guillotine blade. "And you," she continued, her voice rising slightly, each word a hammer blow against Calloway's crumbling composure, "just arrested your boss." The silence that followed was deafening. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath that echoed through the street. Calloway's face drained of all color, his eyes wide with disbelief. He stared at Simone, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, unable to form a coherent sentence. His internal world, Simone knew, had just imploded. His carefully constructed reality, his sense of authority, his entire career, all reduced to rubble in the space of a single sentence. Briggs' eyes widened, a mixture of shock and understanding dawning on his face. He turned to Calloway, his gaze now filled with a cold, hard fury. The air crackled with unspoken accusations, the weight of the situation pressing down on them like a physical force. The bystanders, once silent observers, erupted in a cacophony of whispers and murmurs, their phones capturing every detail of the unfolding drama. The man in the suit, Simone noticed, was watching with a grim satisfaction, a silent nod of acknowledgement passing between them. Justice, she thought, had a strange way of revealing itself. The biting chill of the late afternoon air, a stark contrast to the burning shame that scorched Calloway's insides, seeped through his uniform. The precinct buzzed with hushed whispers, the usual cacophony of police radio chatter strangely muted. Each click of a keyboard, each rustle of paper, felt like a tiny hammer blow against the fragile shell of his composure. Just minutes ago, the world had been ordered predictable, divided neatly into the lawful and the lawless. Now, the lines were blurred, and he stood on the wrong side. He could feel the weight of 100 pairs of eyes, assessing, judging, condemning. Had they always looked at him this way? He'd never noticed before. He'd been too busy looking, too busy enforcing his own version of justice. Captain Briggs' office loomed before him, the wooden door a dark, imposing barrier. His hand trembled slightly as he knocked, a hollow thud that echoed the emptiness growing within him. The terse enter that followed was devoid of any warmth, a harbinger of the inevitable. The air inside the office was thick with tension. Briggs sat behind his desk, his face a mask of controlled fury. The nameplate on his desk seemed to mock Calloway, a gleaming symbol of the authority he was about to lose. Calloway swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. "Sergeant Calloway," Briggs began, his voice low and dangerous, each word a precise incision. "You're relieved of duty." The words hung in the air, heavy, final. Calloway felt a dizzying rush of disbelief. Relieved of duty? Him? He'd given 15 years of his life to this force. 15 years of chasing shadows, of confronting danger, of upholding the law his law. His stomach churned with a mixture of fear and indignation. He opened his mouth to protest, but the words caught in his throat. "Hand over your badge and gun." The command, sharp and unwavering, broke through the fog of his denial. He fumbled for his badge, his fingers clumsy and unresponsive. The familiar weight of it in his palm felt foreign, alien. This small, metal shield, once a symbol of his power, now felt like a brand of shame. He placed it on Briggs' desk, the quiet clink amplifying the deafening roar of his collapsing world. Then, with trembling hands, he unholstered his weapon, the cold steel a stark reminder of the power he had so readily abused. As the gun left his hand, a strange sense of detachment washed over him. It was as if he were watching himself, a detached observer in a play he hadn't auditioned for. He felt hollowed out, emptied of purpose. What was he without his badge, without his gun? Just Brian, a man stripped bare, exposed to the judgmental gaze of the world. He hadn't even registered her presence until she spoke. You think your badge gives you the right to stop whoever you want. Simone Daniels stood in the doorway, her voice calm, yet laced with steel. Her eyes, dark and unwavering, held a depth of emotion that Calloway couldn't decipher. Anger? Disappointment? Pity? He couldn't tell. He only knew that her gaze pierced through him, exposing the raw, festering wound of his prejudice. He wanted to defend himself, to justify his actions, but the words wouldn't come. He knew, deep down, that there was no justification. He had acted on impulse, driven by assumptions and ingrained biases that he had never bothered to question. I thought, he stammered, his voice barely a whisper, the confident swagger he usually projected completely gone. He trailed off, the futility of any explanation weighing heavily on him. You thought what, Sergeant? Daniel's voice was soft now, but the quiet intensity of it was more cutting than any shout. You thought that because I was jogging in a predominantly white neighborhood, I must be up to no good? You thought that because of the color of my skin, I was a threat. Her words hit him like a physical blow, each one a stark reminder of the ugliness he had harbored within himself. He looked away, unable to meet her gaze, the shame burning hotter than ever. The faces of the bystanders who had witnessed his actions flashed through his mind, their expressions of disbelief and disgust mirroring his own self-loathing. The silence in the room stretched, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. Each tick seemed to amplify the weight of his transgression. The world outside the window seemed to continue on, oblivious to the turmoil raging within him. People went about their lives, laughing, talking, existing in a reality he no longer felt a part of. Your actions, Daniels continued, her voice still quiet but laced with a new kind of weariness, reflect not only on you, but on the entire force. They perpetuate the very stereotypes we are sworn to dismantle. They erode the trust that is essential for us to do our jobs effectively. Calloway closed his eyes, the truth of her words sinking deep into his soul. He had betrayed the badge, betrayed the trust placed in him, betrayed his own humanity. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. He opened his eyes and looked at Daniels, truly looked at her, seeing not just a black woman, not just a superior officer, but a human being he had wronged. A wave of remorse, so profound it threatened to drown him, washed over him. I'm sorry, he managed to choke out, the words thick with shame and regret. I made a mistake. The apology felt inadequate, hollow even to his own ears, but it was all he had. He looked at Briggs, his face etched with the bitter knowledge that his career, his life as he knew it, was over. He had built his identity on the foundation of law and order, and now that foundation had crumbled beneath him, leaving him adrift in a sea of uncertainty and regret. The world, once so clearly defined, now felt fragmented, distorted, a terrifying reflection of the fractured man he had become. The silence in the room stretched, heavy and oppressive, the weight of his actions crushing him. He had been so certain, so sure of himself, but now, all he felt was the chilling emptiness of a man lost, a man adrift, a man finally forced to confront the dark shadows within his own soul. The steering wheel was cold beneath his clammy hands. The vinyl creaked softly as his fingers tightened, a pathetic counterpoint to the roaring silence in his head. He sat in his patrol car, engine off, the world outside a blurry, muted film playing out beyond the windshield. The street where, only minutes before, he'd stood tall, badge gleaming, authority radiating like heat from asphalt, now seemed alien, accusatory. The air in the car was thick, suffocating, a physical manifestation of the shame coiling in his gut. He could still feel the phantom weight of Simone Daniels' gaze on him, the controlled fury in her eyes burning a hole through his carefully constructed facade of righteous indignation. Chief Daniels. Chief Daniels. The words echoed in the hollow spaces of his mind, each syllable a hammer blow shattering the foundation of his self-worth. He'd known. Some part of him, buried deep beneath layers of ingrained prejudice and self-justification, had known. He'd seen the tailored suit of the man who'd witnessed the arrest, the subtle but unmistakable air of power. He'd registered the sleek lines of her running shoes, the expensive sports watch on her wrist. But he'd pushed those observations aside, clinging to the narrative he'd already constructed in his mind. Black woman, jogging in a better neighborhood, probably up to no good. A wave of nausea rolled over him. He'd been so sure, so certain of his rightness, of his place in the world as the upholder of law and order. The irony was a bitter pill, lodging in his throat like a shard of glass. He, the protector, had become the aggressor. He, the enforcer of justice, had become the perpetrator of injustice. The faces of the bystanders flashed through his memory, their expressions ranging from disbelief to open hostility. He'd seen that look before, the mixture of fear and disgust reserved for those who abuse their power. He'd always dismissed it as the resentment of criminals and troublemakers. Now he saw it reflected in his own actions, a distorted mirror image of his own failings. His breath hitched in his chest, a sob trapped somewhere between his lungs and his throat. He fumbled for his water bottle, the plastic slick against his trembling fingers. He took a long, shaky gulp, the cool water doing little to quench the burning shame rising within him. Captain Briggs' words, sharp and laced with disappointment, replayed in his ears. "Sergeant Calloway, you've disgraced this department. You've embarrassed yourself." The captain's voice had been low, controlled, yet every word had carried the weight of a judge's gavel, sentencing him to a professional and moral execution. He had tried to explain, to justify, but the words had felt hollow, meaningless even to his own ears. What defense could he offer? What excuse could possibly mitigate the sheer stupidity, the blatant prejudice of his actions? He closed his eyes, his head falling against the headrest. The image of his badge, tarnished and dull, swam in his mind's eye. He'd always worn it with pride, a symbol of his dedication, his commitment to serving and protecting. Now, it felt like a brand, a mark of shame seared onto his soul. He'd spent years building a career, brick by painstaking brick, only to watch it crumble into dust in a matter of minutes. The future, once a clear path stretching before him, now seemed a tangled, impenetrable thicket. What would he do? Where would he go? The question spun in his mind, a dizzying vortex of uncertainty and fear. He thought of his wife, her quiet strength, her unwavering belief in him. How could he face her? How could he explain the inexplicable, confess the ugliness that had festered within him, hidden beneath a veneer of respectability? He'd always seen himself as a good man, a decent man. But the truth, stark and undeniable, was staring back at him from the depths of his own reflection. He was flawed, broken, complicit in a system that perpetuated injustice. He'd upheld the law, yes, but he'd done so selectively, blinded by his own prejudices, deaf to the cries of those he was sworn to protect. A low groan escaped his lips, a sound of despair and self-recrimination. He'd been so focused on maintaining order, on controlling the narrative, that he'd forgotten the fundamental principle of justice, equality. He'd treated Simone Daniels not as an individual, not as a fellow human being, but as a stereotype, a threat. And in doing so, he betrayed not only her, but also himself, his values, and the very oath he'd sworn to uphold. He slammed his fist against the steering wheel, the sharp pain a momentary distraction from the deeper ache in his heart. He was trapped, caught in a web of his own making. He'd spent years reinforcing the bars of this prison, brick by prejudiced brick, and now he was suffocating within its confines. The silence in the car pressed in on him, heavy and suffocating. Outside, the world continued to move, oblivious to his inner turmoil. Cars passed, people walked by, their lives unfolding in a rhythm he no longer felt part of. He was adrift, cut loose from the moorings of his former life, adrift in a sea of uncertainty and regret. When will it stop? The question whispered in the silence, not directed at anyone in particular, not even at himself, but at the vast, in different universe? When will the cycle of prejudice and injustice end? When will we truly see each other, not as stereotypes, not as threats, but as human beings deserving of respect and dignity? The question hung in the air, unanswered, a chilling testament to the long, arduous journey that still lay ahead.